association with John Deutsch cost him that appointment. My good friend Dick Gregory, who I just did a radio show with on Thanksgiving Day, called me up and said he said he was talking to some people in Washington, and they just chewed him up one side and down the other because he looked like a fool. Everybody here seen The Wizard of Oz? Everybody here seen The Man Behind the Curtain? We have to get to the man behind the curtain, but it's going to be a little bit scarier than that movie was to do that. So, let's take an approach to September the 11th along the lines of an investigator presenting a case to a grand jury, or along the lines of a detective presenting a case to a district attorney. First of all, who am I? We're going to go through this really quickly. I had the misfortune of being born into a family that was heavily rooted in the intelligence community. My mother was a cryptographer and cryptanalyst for the Army Security Agency and National Security Agency during World War II. She worked for Secretary of State Cordell Hull. She worked on the Japanese and Russian codes. By the way, we did know the Japs were going to attack Pearl Harbor, and we did let it happen. This is evidence that I would present. This is my mother's separation from the NSA in December 1949 because she was going to have babies. She didn't have me until 51. But my dad was also recalled into the Air Force during the Korean War. He went to work for Martin Marietta and went to work on projects like the Titan 3C, which put up all the CIA's keyhole spy satellites. Relatives of my father were OSS, that's the forerunner of CIA, and they were career at CIA in Langley. So everybody in the family had a clearance. I used to come home from school and say, "What's for dinner?" And Mom would say, "I can't tell you." That's a joke, I hope. Now what I need is a way to do this so that I don't get them all whacked up here. Continuing with the presentation, there's a couple of points I want to make here in Portland. This is one of my rating reports from LAPD showing an outstanding rating, showing also that I have, especially in the field of narcotics enforcement and investigative procedures, I was loaned to Wilshire Division Narcotics several times and specialized in narcotics. I was even sent to a training school by the U.S. Department of Justice and the DEA, which I attended. You don't get that for writing parking tickets. And the reason why I say this is because the ranking member of LAPD in the room that day when I confronted John Deutsch told Ted Koppel that I had never worked narcotics. And that got me pulled from a live interview with Ted Koppel. The ranking member of LAPD in the room that day was Deputy Chief Mark Croker. Yeah, I'm having fun already. Now I want to talk about CIA dealing drugs briefly because I have to lay a foundation. You have to understand the economic and the political context in which this war is taking place and in which it is set. And there's two things that if you don't understand, you will never understand September the 11th. One is drugs, the other is oil. Or one is oil, the other is drugs, okay? We want to talk about evidence. We want to talk about proof, okay? This is a memorandum that was written February 11th, 1982 to the Honorable William J. Casey. Everybody remember Bill Casey from Iran-Contra? CIA Director, signed by Attorney General William French Smith. This was at the beginning of the Contra War, very early in the Reagan administration. And something had happened before this. There had been a series of negotiations. Now in the CIA, the highest rung on the food chain is called an officer. If you are a case officer at CIA, you are someone who cannot be disavowed or denied. You are a man of the cloth. You are a man blessed with immunity. The agency will protect you. But underneath that on the food chain, they have career agents, contract agents, foreign agents, informants. They have proprietary companies, employees of the there's a whole category of people. Well, in 1982, because the CIA knew there was going to be a massive explosion in cocaine trafficking that they were going to control, U.S. Cocaine consumption went from roughly 80 metric tons in 1979 to 600 metric tons by 1987. Think about that for a minute. That's a lot of coke. All right? They knew that was coming. All right? So one of the things they did legally, because the agency and the government, they always find paper ways to try to cover their trail, and they think nobody will catch them. One of my favorite lines of all time, and for the first 100 of you who got here, you got a free copy of my last issue of From the Wilderness, is from Alan Dulles, who, when the Warren Commission report was released, however many volumes there were, and you read those volumes and you know that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't kill John Kennedy. And Alan Dulles said, the American people don't read. You don't read. This memorandum says, first of all, they took all the people who were not case officers and they decided to call them non-employees of the Central Intelligence Agency. There's a federal law stating that if a federal employee breaks a federal law, you have to report him. They were caught on the horns of a dilemma. So first they said, well, all these people are not employees, even though they get CIA paychecks. And then they said, in light of these provisions and in view of the fine cooperation the Drug Enforcement Administration has received from CIA, no formal requirement regarding the reporting of narcotics violations has been included in these procedures. That's black and white evidence of a conspiracy. The Attorney General of the United States just told the CIA director he no longer had to report it when anybody other than a case officer was dealing drugs. Let's look at something else about how cynical these people are. Now, I've been studying CIA and the drug trade for about 23 years, and this is one of my favorite documents of all time. Some 28 C-130 Hercules were smuggled by the CIA and the Pentagon through the U.S. Forest Service into private hands, supposedly for the purpose of fighting forest fires. The problem is that some of them turned up in Peru, in Mexico, in Panama, in Angola, in Iran, and Iraq, running covert missions for the CIA. One of these C-130s was caught in Mexico City. Aeropostal de Mexico had it, with $1 billion worth of cocaine on board. The Forest Service, having let these airplanes out, found itself in a kind of embarrassing position. So they had their lawyers work on it, and notice the last sentence. DOD is the Department of Defense. Apparently, DOD thinks that by having the Forest Service as the intermediary, if any future aircraft are used in drug smuggling, the Forest Service and not DOD will suffer the adverse publicity. They don't care about stopping it, they care about who's going to take the blame. It is possible to nail these people, but you have to know how to approach. The main reason why the CIA deals drugs is for one reason and one reason only. It's not to fund covert operations. The main reason is not to weed out the gene pool, although I will tell you, and I have proven that blacks have been deliberately targeted, but the CIA brings in more drugs than all the African Americans could use in this country. The main reason the CIA deals drugs is to support the U.S. economy. Let's take a look for a second. I don't know if you can read this in the back, but I'll call the names out. We're going to see something that's very unusual here. The National Security Act of 1947 created the CIA. It was written by a man named Clark Clifford, who was a longtime aide to Harry Truman. Okay? Clark Clifford's profession was he was a Wall Street banker and lawyer. Clark Clifford is also the man who brought a bank called BCCI into the United States in the 1980s, a drug money laundering bank that was exposed for laundering drug money. The design for the CIA, in other words, the people who told Clifford how to write the act, were two brothers, John Foster and Alan Dulles, the Dulles brothers, Duller, and Dulles. John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State to President Dwight Eisenhower. Alan Dulles was the DCI, not from 81 to 87. He was the DCI from, I think, roughly 1953 until about 61 in the Bay of Pigs when John F. Kennedy fired him. You know what their profession was? Wall Street lawyers at the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, which is today the most powerful law firm on Wall Street. Bill Casey, the man we just saw the memo addressed to. We know he was Ronald Reagan's DCI. What did Bill Casey do for Richard Nixon? He was chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Stanley Sporkin, one of my favorite turkeys, was CIA General Counsel during the 80s. He used to email back and forth with Oliver North. Dear Stanley to Ollie, Stanley to Ollie. It was very funny. Okay? Do you know what he did before he became... No, he was the General Counsel to the SEC. Securities and Exchange Commission, charged with monitoring all securities transactions. David Daugherty, CIA General Counsel after Stanley Sporkin. You know what he does today? The Executive Vice President of the New York Stock Exchange for enforcement. Isn't that great? And then we have a gentleman by the name of A.B. Buzzy Krongard, and we're going to hear a lot about Buzzy Krongard tonight. Buzzy Krongard is currently the CIA Executive Director. The top three positions are DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, DDI, Deputy Director of Intelligence, and Executive Director. Buzzy Krongard was, until 1998, the head of an investment bank called A.B. Brown. A.B. Brown is involved in insider trading connected to September the 11th. He's a Wall Street banker. As a matter of fact, 6 out of 7 of the first deputy directors of intelligence came to CIA from Wall Street. The mission of the CIA is to control money and cash flow for the benefit not of you and me, but for the benefit of the banks and the stock brokerage houses and all of the interests that control U.S. politics. Now, the U.S. economy is in deep trouble. But the level of criminality in this government and in this country has become so overt in the last 2 years that the stink is becoming hard for people to ignore. This is a story from the Associated Press, June 27th, 1999. New York Stock Exchange chief, that's a guy by the name of Dick Grasso, hops on an airplane in New York City and flies to Bogota, Colombia, hops in an armor-plated limousine and drives up to the foothills in the mountains that are occupied by the FARC guerrillas, who occupy a third of Colombia. They tax the cocaine. Everybody in Colombia deals drugs. But what did he ask them to do? He asked the FARC guerrillas to invest their drug profits in Wall Street. There's an AP story right there. He didn't say stop dealing drugs, it's bad for our kids. He said, let us manage your drug money. The FARC said, we think we would rather keep our money in Colombia for the benefit of Colombians. Why should we send it to New York? And what happened a year later was Bill Clinton announced Plan Colombia. And don't get me wrong here, Colombia is on the list of countries where this administration is planning to go to war because there's also oil there. All right. Still laying a foundation, but we're getting ready to move into September 11th. Let's look at a little history of the Bush family. I'm having a lot of fun. Okay. This is from a book called The Unauthorized Biography of George Bush, which is an extremely well-researched book. And everything that they put in here is sourced. If we go to George Herbert Walker Bush's father, Prescott Bush, he was the managing director of a firm called Brown Brothers Harriman. during the 30s and 40s. Brown Brothers Harriman financed Adolf Hitler before and during World War II. Brown Brothers Harriman got involved with the Hamburg steamship line. They got involved with a number of companies and front organizations that channeled money directly to Adolf Hitler, and they did not stop that relationship when the war began. As a matter of fact, one particular firm, it was a bank, affiliated, it was the Union Bank, affiliated with the Thyssen, that's Thyssen Steel Trust, managed by Prescott Bush, produced 50.8% of Nazi Germany's pig iron, 41.4% of Nazi Germany's universal plate, 36% of Nazi Germany's heavy plate, 38.5% of Nazi Germany's galvanized steel, 45.5% of Nazi Germany's pipes and tubes, 22% of Nazi Germany's wire, and 35% of Nazi Germany's explosives. It was so egregious and offensive that we find that in 1942, under the Trading with the Enemy Act, the U.S. government took over the Union Banking Corporation, in which Prescott Bush was a director, and they seized the assets. That's our current president's grandfather. Now, we know that our current president's father went out of his way to arm Saddam Hussein. How many people remember Iraqgate? I have an excellent story on that. There's monstrous, wonderful sourcing on the fact that George Herbert Walker Bush created the enemy which he fought in 1991. And so it is currently with Osama bin Laden. Now, how important is drug money? The International Monetary Fund published a report in January of this year showing that $1.5 trillion, trillion with a T, a year is laundered through the World Banking System. Of that, according to Le Monde and according to the U.S. Department of Justice, it's very safe to say that $500 billion to $600 billion of that is directly the result of the drug trade. Why is drug cash important? How many people here have a credit card? All right, now I want you to be real truthful when you answer this. When you open your credit card bill every month, what do you look at first? I want everybody to look first at the total balance owing on the card. Raise your hand. How many of you look first at the minimum monthly payment required? How many of you pay your credit cards off in full every month? I'm impressed. The point is that the United States economy, and I was at an economic conference in Moscow in March of this year, has derivatives. Derivatives are anything that's not related to anything of value. It's like stock futures, it's calls, it's puts, it's options, it's has a derivatives bubble of $300 trillion. $20 trillion of that alone is connected to J.P. Morgan Chase, which is about ready to go under thanks to Enron. And watch that very closely, okay? Just in March of this year, we had a wonderful piece of evidence come up from Senator Carl Levin's minority report to the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and it was a report on correspondent banks and money laundering. Now, this is a story from the Washington Post dated February 5th. It says, inattention and disinterest by U.S. banks in screening the foreign banks they take as clients has allowed rogue foreign banks, not rogue, and their criminal clients to carry on money laundering and other criminal activity in the United States and to benefit from the protections afforded by the safety and the soundness of the U.S. banking industry, said Senator Carl Levin of Michigan. Specifically mentions J.P. Morgan Chase on the next page. 4,000 offshore banks to launder money into the United States. $1 trillion laundered annually. That's conservative. Money laundered in which the Clinton administration declared a national security threat. Not true. It's a national asset as far as Wall Street is concerned. Carl Levin said $500 billion moved through the U.S. banking system in drug money every year. That's liquid cash. And you want to know how important liquid cash in this world? There's a saying. One of my dear friends and colleagues and mentors, Catherine Austin Fitts, is a former Assistant Secretary of Housing. She was a managing director of Dillon Reed on Wall Street. She says cash flow is everything. And in an economy that's on the verge of a major implosion, without cash flow, the crash is guaranteed. Now, CIA's role is to make sure that as much of that drug money comes through the U.S. economy as possible.
When I was a little girl, I grew up at 48th and Larchwood in West Philadelphia, and the Salary Index was 100%. The Salary Index is the index that I use to describe the well-being of a neighborhood. It's the percent of people in a neighborhood who believe that a child can leave their home, go to the nearest place to buy a popsicle, and come home alone safely. It was unthinkable that a child wasn't safe at 48th and Larchwood in West Philadelphia in the 1950s. The Salary Index was 100%, and the Dow Jones Index was probably about 500. Today, it's reversed. The Dow Jones Index is very high at about 10,000, and the Salary Index is at very low in West Philadelphia and very low throughout the United States. And why is that? It's because one of the ways that we've financed the growth of multinational corporations and big banks and the rise of the Dow Jones is by selling narcotics to our children. It's one of the most profitable businesses in America.